Imagine a philosopher, a thinker so far ahead of his time that his ideas from 900 years ago sound like they were written for today's headlines. This is the story of Al-Ghazali, a giant of Islamic thought who rose through the intellectual ranks to hold one of the most prestigious teaching positions in the world by his mid-30s. But it wasn't his fame that made him unique. It was his refusal to accept the status quo. He looked around and saw a world getting richer, with markets expanding and wealth growing. But something felt deeply wrong. He saw a society obsessed with money, but spiritually adrift. An economy that was booming on the outside, but rotting from within. Does that sound familiar? Al-Ghazali dared to ask a question that still haunts us today. What happens when a civilization gets rich faster than it gets wise? To find the answer, he turned his attention to the very nature of money itself. And this is where things get really fascinating. Most people know Al-Ghazali, a religious scholar, but he was also one of the first philosophers to analyze money in moral and systemic terms. While Aristotle saw money as just a practical tool and later economists saw it as a mathematical equation, Al-Ghazali focused on its psychological and spiritual impact. He studied how money shapes our behavior, our incentives, our trust in each other, and ultimately, the fate of entire nations. To grasp his economic ideas, you have to understand how he viewed money at its core. For Al-Ghazali, money was never meant to be worshipped, hoarded, or used as a symbol of status. It was a tool, pure and simple, a facilitator of exchange. He came up with a brilliant analogy, comparing money to a mirror. A mirror has no value on its own, its worth comes from what it reflects. Money, he argued, is exactly the same. Its power isn't in the gold or silver coins, but in what it allows people to trade, to build, and to cooperate. This is an idea modern economists often claim as their own, but Al-Ghazali was writing about it in the 11th century, a time when most of Europe still defined wealth as land or loot from war. From this simple but profound foundation, he developed one of his most powerful insights: hoarded money is dead money. For him, wealth locked away in chests, hidden under floors, or buried in courtyards wasn't just useless, it was socially destructive. He argued that idle wealth doesn't circulate. It doesn't pay wages, fund trade, or support families. It literally strangles the life out of an economy. In a line that could have been written by a modern critic of inequality, he described hoarding as freezing the bloodstream of society. But Al-Ghazali wasn't just complaining about personal greed. His argument was systemic. He understood that when the wealthy hoard money, they create artificial scarcity. It's not that there aren't enough resources to go around. It's that the means of exchange are blocked. When that happens, prices get distorted, markets break down, and ordinary people suffer. This critique led him to his next major idea: speculation destroys trust. Al-Ghazali had zero patience for merchants who manipulated prices, created artificial shortages, or exploited crises for their own profit. He didn't see this as clever business strategy. He saw it as moral corruption. It was profit without contribution. He wrote, "Whoever profits from the suffering of others, profits from corruption," and in his view, corruption was like a disease. Once it takes hold, it spreads through markets, institutions, and eventually infects the entire social fabric. If this sounds like a commentary on modern financial bubbles, predatory lending, or pandemic profiteering, well, it is. It was just written 9 centuries ago. But don't get the wrong idea. Al-Ghazali wasn't anti-profit or anti-business. He wasn't advocating for a life of poverty. On the contrary, he believed strongly in trade. He saw markets as natural and necessary, and believed that creating wealth could be a meaningful, even noble, pursuit. What he fiercely opposed was dishonest trade, cheating, lying, using false weights and measures, hiding defects in products, or manipulating information. He understood a fundamental truth: markets can only function when people trust each other. In this sense, He was one of the earliest thinkers to describe what modern economists call transaction costs, information asymmetry, and moral hazard. He just did it without the complicated jargon. Another of his core insights was the inherent value of labor. He argued that work itself was dignified, while unearned wealth was spiritually dangerous. For him, money earned through real effort builds character. Money accumulated through manipulation, speculation, or inheritance rots it from the inside out. This might sound like a simple moral lesson, but the logic behind it was deeply practical. Societies grow strong when people contribute real value. They grow weak when people, us, learn how to exploit the system, and Al-Ghazali didn't just stop at individuals and merchants. He also turned his critical eye toward the state itself, delivering one of history's earliest critiques of government currency manipulation. In medieval times, just like today, rulers would often dilute gold or silver coins with cheaper metals to stretch their budgets. This was essentially a hidden tax on the people, what we now call inflation. Al-Ghazali condemned this practice in the strongest terms. To him, debasing the currency wasn't just bad economic policy, it was theft. He argued that the government's primary duty regarding money was to keep it stable and reliable, to protect its value so that it could serve its true function as a fair and trusted medium of exchange. When the state itself cheats, it signals to everyone that cheating is acceptable, and the spiral of corruption begins. So, here we have an 11th century thinker who diagnosed the dangers of wealth inequality, speculative bubbles, corporate greed, and government-induced inflation. He understood that a healthy economy is built on trust, honest labor, and the free circulation of wealth, not on hoarding, manipulation, and exploitation. Al-Ghazali's message wasn't just for his time, it was for all time. He reminds us that the economy is just a machine for generating wealth. It's a moral ecosystem. And when we forget that, when we prioritize profit over people and accumulation over contribution, we risk losing not just our fortunes, but our souls. His ancient wisdom forces us to ask ourselves the same question he did. Are we getting richer? Or are we just getting lost? Have you ever wondered why economies collapse? It's not always about running out of money or resources. 1,000 years ago, a scholar named Al-Ghazali gave us an answer that feels startlingly modern. He argued that a society can survive poverty, but it cannot survive corruption. Let's explore how his ancient wisdom serves as a diagnostic report for our current financial age. Al-Ghazali lived in a time of political turmoil. He saw rulers and governments do exactly what they do today when they feel their power slipping. They tighten their grip on the economy. Some raised taxes to painful levels. Others manipulated the currency, and some seized private assets or borrowed recklessly, leaving a mess for future generations. Sound familiar? To Al-Ghazali, these weren't just bad policies, they were symptoms of a deeper disease. He believed that corruption at the top radiates downward like a poison. When a ruler cheats his people, merchants feel justified in cheating their customers. When institutions lack integrity, individuals stop acting with responsibility. The entire economic system, from the national treasury to the local market, becomes a chain reaction of distrust. This brings us to his most powerful insight. Economies do and collapse because the numbers stop adding up. They collapse because the people inside the system stop trusting each other. Trust is the invisible glue holding every transaction, every contract, and every currency together. When that glue dissolves, even the wealthiest nation becomes fragile. Consider his views on currency. For Al-Ghazali, a stable currency depended entirely on honesty. When a government debased its coins by diluting the gold or silver content, it wasn't just poor policy, it was deception. It was a betrayal. A ruler tampering with currency was, in his eyes, stealing from his own people in slow motion. He warned that this erodes trust and punishes the poor, who receive weaker coins for their labor. He predicted that if a state manipulated its currency too often, people would eventually lose faith, abandon the local money, and start using stronger foreign currencies. Think about it, 1,000 years later. This exact scenario played out in Weimar Germany, Zimbabwe, Venezuela, and Argentina. Every time people flee their own money, it's because they no longer trust the promises behind it. Our modern anxieties about inflation reflect exactly what this medieval scholar understood. Money is ultimately a belief system. Once people stop believing, the system stops working. But Al-Ghazali's insights went deeper than just currency and taxes. He understood human nature. People hoard out of fear. They speculate out of greed. They cheat when they think they can get away with it. And when a society reaches a point where exploitation becomes normal, collapse is already underway. This is why you can't fix an economy without fixing the incentives that shape human behavior. Laws and markets matter, but behind them are people driven by emotion, ambition, and fear. Unless a society's systems guide those incentives toward honest, productive behavior, the economy will inevitably drift toward corruption and instability. This led him to another critical point, the moral dimension of wealth. To Al-Ghazali, wealth without responsibility and just spiritually dangerous. It was a direct threat to the common good. He wasn't against wealth itself. He believed it was simply incomplete without a purpose. A society grows strong when its people contribute more than they extract, when the drive to accumulate is balanced by the duty to uplift others. But when the pursuit of profit ignores the welfare of the community, the entire system becomes brittle. A selfish society eventually collapses under its own weight. Now, let's bring this into the 21st century. We live in a global economy where money moves faster than meaning, wealth inequality is at historic highs, and trust in our institutions is declining year after year. Everywhere you look, there are echoes of the problems Al-Ghazali described. His critique of hoarding mirrors today's debates about billionaires and offshore accounts. His warnings about speculation sound like discussions about housing crises and crypto volatility. And his condemnation of manipulated currency is at the very heart of today's monetary policy debates. What's so striking is how little the underlying human behaviors have changed. The technology is different, the markets are faster, the scale is global, but the drivers are the same. Al-Ghazali would likely look at our world at the runaway debt, speculative frenzies, and widening inequality and say exactly what he wrote 1,000 years ago. Where justice is lost, prosperity cannot remain. It's an uncomfortable truth. Economies break down when incentives reward the wrong behaviors and when institutions fail to uphold the fairness that makes markets possible. Human emotion, greed, and fear, not abstract economic formulas, are what push civilizations toward crisis. Al-Ghazali wasn't just preaching religion, he was describing reality. He understood that money is not a mechanical object, it's a moral ecosystem. When that moral framework disintegrates, the financial system is sure to follow. In an era defined by record debt, institutional mistrust, and financial anxiety, his central message becomes a survival principle. If money becomes detached from morality, the system will eventually break. Understanding this idea isn't just financial education, it's financial protection. History doesn't repeat itself exactly, but if you don't understand its lessons, it can crush you all the same. If this gave you a new perspective, hit that subscribe button. History has the answers, and I'll show you where to find them. Thanks for watching.